Okay, I'm going to be speaking about the art world for the last 120 years. Now, human beings have been doing art and enjoying art for tens of thousands of years. There's something that is deeply human about engagement with art. But if you know art history, the last century, 100 years, has been the most unusual century in the world of art. And for most of us who love art or who are interested in art, who have some engagement, that's all of us, right? We encounter what is going on in the modern art world, the postmodern art world, and most of us initially are confused, we are bewildered, sometimes we are disgusted, we don't understand, we shake our heads. And so one of the questions I'm going to ask today is, why did the art world become so unusual over the course of the last 100 years? And there are reasons for it. Behind the apparent nonsense, there is sense, right? But it's not necessarily a sense that fits with your understanding of what is sensible and so forth. Now, I'm a philosopher by training and by profession, and one of the reasons why art has changed so dramatically is philosophical. And I want to argue today that the most important reason why art made its major change, 1890s, 1900s, the generation before the First World War, was a series of revolutions that had occurred in the philosophical world. And artists, even if they're not philosophers by training, are nonetheless very philosophical. When we do art and when we experience art, we are always asking ourselves, what really matters? Now, there's a follow-up question that I want to address, and that is, one thing that has been characteristic of art history is the rapidity with which the art world changes. Different styles, different motifs, different genres. And so if you take a course on the history of art, particularly once you get into the last 1,000 years, there are so many different movements and changes and dramatic breaks in style. And one very interesting thing about the last century is how little has changed. That it's the same sorts of themes, the same territory that is being worked over and over and over again. And we are 4 generations, 5 generations into it. Why has the art world not moved on? Why is there not another new radical break to another movement and so forth? It seems stuck. And the reason I'm going to offer is that, again, philosophy is important. That at the turn of the 20th century, about 100 years ago, there was a philosophical framework that was broadly adopted. And it was a very skeptical, cynical, in some cases nihilistic understanding of the world. And that was picked up by the artists and communicated, and it required some fairly dramatic changes in how you do art if you have a very skeptical, nihilistic, value-empty understanding of the world. And not much has changed in terms of the guiding philosophy of the contemporary high art world. Art is very personal. At the same time, it is very universal. And that's one of the interesting things about art. You are an artist and you are going to portray what it is to be a human being. You're going to go in very different directions. Right? The Greek direction versus the human beings are shameful and should cower and fall down. And what about politics? Should we, in our art, say anybody can be represented? We're interested in all human beings from all walks of life. Or since we know that art is so powerful, is art something that should be politically controlled? And only artists who are doing representations perhaps of kings or aristocrats or generals who have accomplished something, maybe Olympic athletes who are doing something very special. But only art, because of its importance, is allowed to do special human beings. And people who are not worthy, those should not be the proper subject matter of art. So, do we believe that art should be free and accessible to all human beings, that we should be interested in the full range of human experience, or is art politically something that should be controlled and reserved for those whom the political leadership considers to be important? And then the subject matters. What do we think about sex? What do we think about race? What do we think about power and justice? The whole range of values. Do we let artists express anything they want? Or do we say some viewpoints are morally wrong and they should not be allowed to be expressed? So the point of all of this is now we're raising questions about metaphysics and the nature of reality, what it is to be a human being. What are the important values? Should people be free or controlled? Should we be egalitarian or elitist? And all of those philosophical questions have great bearing on how artists. So to be an artist, you have to engage with those questions, and that's part of the power of art. And it also explains why in art history, art has gone through various cycles of engagement and disengagement, higher aspirations and lower aspirations, depending on what the prevailing philosophy of the era has been. Now, that said, I want to jump to our era, right? And I want to bracket it by the year 1917 because it was about a century ago, so the mathematics is almost perfect, right? Because we're at 2019 now. But three things happened in 1917 that are indicative of the time period and what has changed or not changed since 1917. So I want to give you the first one. Here's the first one. All right, I could do this as an art history test, right? Whose work is this? So this is Marcel Duchamp. This is a work called Fountain, and it was exhibited in New York in 1917. New York had just recently become the new center of the art world. Sort of the interesting things, we'll come back to this, is that if you go to the 1400s, there was Italy. By the time you get to the 15 and 1600s, it's moving to Amsterdam and the Low Countries in Holland. And then into the 1700s, it's London, and 1800s, it's Paris, and then by the time we get to the 1900s, it's the United States, New York, Hollywood, and so forth. So this is a statement, what's going on in New York in 1917. Now, Duchamp is an artist. This is, well, you recognize what this is, right? Well, not really. Well, maybe. But yes, he went to a hardware store, bought a urinal, took it back. He put this R. Mutt, he just wrote that on there, sent it in, of course, the date, 1917, and this is his statement about art. Now, why this matters? Because if you go 1 century later, we're now into the 2000s, and there's a survey done of British and American artists, over 1,000 of them, asking them to name the most important, influential artist on their thinking and development as an artist. Now, we would come up with all sorts of names, right? We might say Andy Warhol, we might say Pablo Picasso, and those guys came in second and third. Number one most important artist of the 20th century, according to leading 20th century artists, was this guy, Marcel Duchamp. And that's interesting. So what is going on with this, such that not only is it part of the art world, but it is judged by those inside the art world as the most important piece of art of the past century. And it is still with them. 1917, also in Michigan, in Dearborn, the brand new high-tech Ford Motor Company mass production automobile plant opened. And it is, of course, a marvel of modern engineering, right? The number of cars that can be produced, the cost of those cars, the quality of those cars, and of course Ford is a household name. So in 1917, there are those who are saying this is amazing, awesome, what the modern world is able to do. Henry Ford is a hero of the business and engineering world. But the reaction in the art world was negative, consistently negative, still in France, in England, and in the United States. So I've got one representative quotation here. Alfred Stieglitz, speaking for the artistic community in the early 20s. Every time I see a Ford car, something in me revolts. So he looks at that and he says, that's disgusting. That's repulsive. I hate where the modern world is going. So what's going on there? Well, we can say, well, this is a mass production facility and everything is broken down. And here we have human beings, but the machine is going along and the human beings have to keep up with the machine. And the new part comes along, I have to do what the boss told me to do, what the machine is making me do. And so the modern world, with its engineering and its business achievements and the entrepreneurship that is built into this, is then seen not as a progressive force, but as something that is dehumanizing us. It amounts to a threat, an attack on what it is to be a human being. And so a huge part of the artistic movement is then a reaction against industrialization, against mechanization, against businessmen like Henry Ford who can make $1 million. So that's also 1917. And then also 1917, the Russian Revolution. It's a bit of a cliche. Of course, artists have always been engaged with politics. It's always there. But one of the very interesting things about the last 100 years is how much politics is front and center in much of the art world. So it's not just that art is about family life and religion and nature and human beings and sex and politics too, right? For much of the 20th century, politics has come to be the most important aspect, and for many artists and sub-movements within modernism and postmodernism, it is explicitly and almost exclusively a political exercise. And of course, the portion of the political spectrum, I don't know how you divide the political spectrum, right, or if you need multiple spectra, but the portions of the political spectrum that are most dominant within the art world for the last century is relatively narrow. It's a small portion of the political spectrum that has been dominant. Realism, that is to say, the kind of art that was rejected by the modernists when they started to break everything apart, when they started to go into abstract expressionism, right? And you go to the gallery and you look at it and you say, what is it? I don't know. You try looking at it this way, you look at it that way, and you talk to someone who is supposed to be very smart about what's going on in art, and they say some words, right? And you're an intelligent person, and then 30 seconds later, you have no idea what that person just told you and what it is supposed to mean. So, right, why is that? And that then is to say, but notice what he is saying here. This is the guy who's the founding editor of the New Criterion, much more conservative in their orientation than I am, but nonetheless, Hilton Kramer is a very perceptive art critic for the New York Times. Realism lacks a persuasive theory. So you want to paint nature, you want to do sculptures of human beings realistically, right? We don't have a good theory about why we should do that. And the argument goes on, to lack that is to lack something crucial. You have to have a good theory, the means by which our experience of individual works is joined to our understanding of the values they signify. Now that's values, individuals, theory, realism. That is to say, the philosophy that grounds and makes possible realism has lost. And there is no such thing as a good, convincing theory to support realism. But what the moderns have and what the postmoderns have is theory. And that theory has convinced the intelligent thinkers, intellectuals, critics, and artists of their generation. So even if we can recognize that it's the same thing over and over again, but we don't necessarily like it, those of us who are not on the modernist and postmodernist side of the equation, we're defenseless in the intellectual battle. And if you don't have a good intellectual game, good theory, good philosophy, you will lose in the high art world. The American Dream. All right, now it's a very optimistic portrayal of the world, but F. Scott Fitzgerald, at the beginning of the 20th century, American author, he believed it to be deceptive, proposing the satisfaction of all desire as an attainable goal and identifying desire with the material. It could only lead to dissatisfaction. Hence, the movement of all his work is toward disillusion. Now, I've pulled this quotation out. It's important. I agree with it. And I've highlighted in red the important concepts: deception, dissatisfaction, disillusion. So we take all of Fitzgerald and reduce him to those three concepts. Frost. Two roads diverged in a yellow wood, and I took the one less traveled. Do you know those lines? Okay, we all learned those in high school as well. Well, what is important about Frost? Beneath the homespun folksiness of the speaker's approach, that is to say, he's kind of a out in the country, rural guy, not a fancy New York City sophisticate, is a vision characterized by bleakness. Okay, I don't know if you know that concept. That's empty, gray, brown, everything dying. Seeing the world as composed of desert places, reflecting a design to frighten and appall. Poems about winter, all right, winter is a metaphor for death, right, are more common than poems about the other seasons. And even in the spring and autumn, poems, the speaker always remembers winter. He's always thinking about death. It's frightening and appalling. T.S. Eliot's The Wasteland. Okay. The poem was not affirmative. Well, yes. The desperate quest for regeneration in a kaleidoscopic landscape. Kaleidoscope, right, so it's this right, landscape of sexual disorder and spiritual desolation remains unfulfilled. I should have also done unfulfilled in red as well. So, desperation, disorder, depression, unfulfillment. The world is a kaleidoscope. Eugene O'Neill, a great playwright. Often we go to literature for understanding of human characters. Good versus evil, mixtures, heroes, laggards, and so forth. If, however, one looks for understanding of the characters in the sense of reasons provided for their behavior. So why do people do what they do? Right? That's what we want to know. Well, one will be disappointed. So, by implication, people do what they do and nobody has any understanding why, at least according to O'Neill. It's a mystery. O'Neill's characters could neither help nor understand what they did. The playwright presented their behavior as essentially inexplicable. That's the philosophical move there. Simply as the inevitable human condition. William Faulkner, this is about his favorite novel, The Sound and the Fury. The Sound and the Fury tells a story of grief and loss. It is in 4 sections, each with a different narrator, each supplying a different piece of the plot. 3 of the narrators are brothers: Benji, the idiot, Quentin, the suicide, and Jason, the business failure. Each of them, for different reasons, mourns the loss of their sister, Carrie. So the 4 important people here are an idiot, a suicide, a failure, and a dead person. Ernest Hemingway. He brought more to his writing than disillusionment or cynicism. This makes me chuckle. I don't know. All right, disillusionment and cynicism. That's not enough. We need more. Right? He brought an ever vivid sense of betrayal. What is life about? How to live with pain became his theme. John Steinbeck, The Grapes of Wrath. He combined naturalist and symbolist techniques to depict his characters' plights, and it expressed simple but strong responses to their sufferings: compassion, outrage, and admiration. Right? Plights, desperate circumstances that you find yourself in and you don't know how to solve your problems. Tennessee Williams, A Streetcar Named Desire, the author of that, the famous playwrights, mid-century, were less concerned over criticisms plays for their violence and their obsession with sexuality, which was regarded by some critics as an almost morbid preoccupation with perversion, murder, rape, drugs, incest, nymphomania. We now know that the shriller voices were attacking Williams for his homosexuality, which we must remember could not be publicly spoken of in this country until comparatively recently. So you get past the homosexuality issue, and this is the center of Tennessee Williams' writing. And this goes on. I'll just highlight loneliness, haunting people, we're driven to extreme behavior, and there's plight again. So take all of those, the ones that I highlighted before, and put them together. This is the world, the best American writers that the smart literary critics say you need to read these people. And if you want to be a significant artist yourself, you need to enter into this world, and this is your world. And it's all negative, empty, right? Desperation, death, pain, cynicism. There's not a hint of a suggestion of anything positive, redeeming, beautiful, heroic. And that is the philosophical framework within which the American artistic community, the dominant one of the 20th century, has been operating. Friedrich Nietzsche, everybody has to know something about Friedrich Nietzsche, the most important philosopher on the 20th century. His influence is everywhere. It cuts across political boundary. You find people from all parts of the political spectrum influenced by Nietzsche. It cuts across all religious, influenced by Nietzsche. He is the deepest, most significant philosopher, and he died in 1900, so in some sense the math is perfect. But one of his famous phrases, of course, is God is dead. Now what he meant by that was not that there had been a God and God had died. It's metaphorical. Right? Religion has died. And religion had been part of human condition for basically forever. But think about what religion does for people and did for people. It gives them a sense that they were created, and that we are special, and that there is a God who is looking out for us and telling us what we should do, and there's ultimately justice in the world because the bad people will get their punishment, good people will get their rewards. When you die, you don't just get put in a box and rot in the earth. You go on, you have survival. But what happens then if you stop believing that? Religion is yanked away from you. You go through a crisis of faith and you can't believe in God anymore. And what Nietzsche is arguing is that's what has happened to us in the modern world, because it's very hard for us to believe those old stories that were told to mostly illiterate people in the desert 2,000 or 3,000 years ago, before anybody knew anything about science. And how are we supposed to believe all of those stories? Come on. But it's happened very fast. And we wrench out this very comforting story of the way the world works, and what are we left with? The sense that we're on our own. There is no God looking after us. We're not special. And maybe when we die, it is a cold, empty grave. And that's where we are culturally. And Nietzsche says a big part of trying to understand the end of the 19th century is how do we wrap our minds around that? Well, if we did not come from a God and we are specially created and we have an immortal soul, where did we come from? We came from animals. And how do animals operate? Well, animals operate by competition for scarce resources, and they fight, and it's brutal. The winners win, the losers lose, and it is a brutal fight for survival. And it's not nice people who survive. It is the predators. We are born of, this is not Darwin's phrase, but nature red in tooth and claw. So the red of blood is on our claws and our teeth because life is a predatory struggle among animals for survival. Karl Marx. We don't believe that there are moral standards that come from God about equality and the lion lying down with the lamb and everybody getting along in heaven. Instead, we are animals on earth, and it's about power and wealth, and it's strong versus weak, and the strong, particularly under capitalism, according to Marx, exploit their weaker people and use that wealth to control politics and further dominate. And the whole human condition then is ugly exploitation and oppression. Sigmund Freud. Yes, Darwin is right. We are born of evolutionary processes, and like the other animals, we have instincts that have been bred into us. And if we are going to survive as animals, animals need to be successful as predators, and that means they need to be aggressive. They like to hunt, they like to kill, they like to tear bodies apart and devour them. And the animals that had those instincts the strongest, the aggressive instincts, particularly now think about males and how easy it is for them to fight and to like to dominate and humiliate, right, other human beings. We are ourselves aggressive predators, and we got to the top of the food chain not by, again, being nice, but by letting those instincts dominate. And of course, we have to kill and eat, but we also have to have sex and reproduce. And so those who have the strongest sex drive and combining that sex drive with aggressiveness, those are the ones that survive. So those of us who are here now, we are at the end of a chain that goes way, way back, and every single one of them was very good at killing and getting someone to go to sex, have bed with them, or if they didn't want to, aggressively raping that person. And that's who we are. Sex and aggression are our dominant instincts. That's what it is to be a human being. And then we can add science. Entropy, discovered late 19th century. The idea is that there's all this energy all over the universe, but what happens is that energy flows from high concentrations to low concentrations, but once the energy is equaled out, nothing can happen. And so the prediction of this scientific theory is that there's not a God, again, organizing the whole world, and there's an ultimate happy ever after in heaven, but rather the whole universe of its energy is eventually going to spread out evenly, and the universe will just die a heat death. So, that's the world. And notice it is a philosophical world that is a early 20th century creation. And the leading architects of it, with the best arguments convincing the most intellectuals, are Nietzsche, Freud, Marx, Darwin, and then some of the more pessimistic interpretations coming out of the sciences. And there's not anything positive or redeeming or progressive about that philosophical framework as I have sketched it. Now, if you then put yourself in a historian's shoes and you start living in the 20th century, you've read your Darwin and your Marx and your Nietzsche and Freud and so forth. Maybe you agree and maybe you don't. But what is actually happening in the world? It's not just philosophical theory. In the 19-teens, we have World War I breaks out, and all of the so-called civilized nations of the world are killing each other. Millions of people die, lives destroyed, maimed, and we're developing new technologies better to kill each other. And the whole world goes on a frenzy of killing for 4 years. What happens 10 years later? An economic depression, horrible. This guy, almost takes over the world. At the end of that, we learn about the Holocaust, and now we're into the 1940s. And then in the next decade, we're back to war again in Korea. And the Cold War, the Soviet Union and the United States now have nuclear weapons and missiles that can fly thousands of miles, and they have more than enough to blow each other up multiple times over. And this is the 1960s. And then we go to war again, right, in Vietnam. And you might not know this one. This is Kent State University in Ohio, a nice Midwestern university. Peaceful student protests that are going on. The governor gets a little panicky, sends in the National Guard, which is kind of a military force, and they end up shooting some students. In the streets of the United States, Detroit, Philadelphia, riots over racial issues. Unemployment at an all-time high rate, ghettos, and so forth. And so now we're up to the 1970s. And the point then is going to be, it's not just philosophy, theory. It is, if you pay attention to what's going on in the world and you read the history a certain way, it's negative, 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 negative. And you're an artist. How do you capture the reality that you think and feel the world to be? Alienation from reality, from other people, from yourself. Destruction. You get so frustrated you just want to destroy and express your rage, anger, and frustration. And so it's not then, I think, accidental that the most sensitive and the most intellectual of the artists are going to be unrelievedly negative. Now this takes us back to Marcel Duchamp in 1917. And what has changed? If art then is a reflection of the way the world is, well, go back to the urinal and think of the urinal as a urinal. What do you do with the urinal, guys? You piss on it. Well, okay, you can try that as well. Piss on it. Right? Piss on everything. It's all shit. It's all pointless. Right? And that's the mood that you have. Now, if you think that the world is ugly and fractured and hideous, and that people are disgusting, even if they might look pretty sometimes, what forms are you going to use? And the argument is going to be, if the world really is ugly, nasty, alienation, empty, aggression, predation, then using those old realistic forms where we have nice colors and proportions and perspectives and everything is nice and neat and fits, that doesn't work to capture this truth. We have to break up the forms. We have to explode the forms. We have to rip off the surface prettiness to get to the ugliness and the emptiness that is really inside. And so the truth is negative and the forms have to be negative as well. What were the old forms? Well, we learn in art history. It's about proportion and perspective, and we learn the mathematics and so forth. But those forms don't work anymore because those presuppose that the world is ordered, causal, everything fits, and so forth. We need to explode that. We need to somehow destroy all of those forms and go for the formless, what seems like chaos and randomness, and perhaps something out of that will emerge. Rauschenberg took one of the de Koonings and says, de Kooning is so great, I feel inadequate, and what do we often do when we feel that we are inferior and people have done a lot better? Well, we hate those people and we just want to smash their stuff, right? People who are driving an old crappy car and you're not sure it's going to start the next time, and it's a cold night and you need to get home, You go out into the parking lot, and there's some guy with his new Ferrari parked there. And you hate that guy. You take your keys and you just scratch the paintwork. Hey, God, yeah, that's right. So if you feel inadequate, you want to destroy, and you give into that. So what Rauschenberg did was took one of de Kooning's paintings, and he worked for hours over the course of several days to just completely obliterate it and destroy it. And the message is, it's only by destroying the past better achievements that I can somehow redeem myself and possibly become an artist. But you find the same thing happening philosophically. There are the modernist early 20th century movements, but by the time we get to the 60s and 70s, the postmodern philosophers are coming along, Foucault, Derrida, and I will just give you a quotation from each of them. Speaking about effacement and just destroying human faces and so forth, here's a quotation from Foucault about his writing. I can lose myself. I just pause there. Traditionally, we say when we write that I want to discover myself or find myself. And now we're in opposite. I can lose myself and appear at last to eyes I will never have to meet again. I am no doubt not the only one who writes in order to have no face. Your face, the most personal part of you, your expression of who you are to the world, and you want to destroy that. And he extends that more generally to the human species. Man is, quote, an invention of recent date that will, quote, soon be erased like a face drawn in sand at the edge of the sea. We're welcoming the erasing of all human faces. From the same time, this is Kate Ellis, philosophical writer of the time, about postmodernism, the apolitical pessimism of postmodernism by which creation is simply a form of defecation. Defecation, a fancy English word for taking a shit. And so Manzoni, an Italian artist on the time, said, well, yes, Duchamp did the urinal. Art is something you piss on. Well, what else can we do? So he took these tins, empty, and he defecated into 30-something of them and sealed them and then offered them for sale as his work of art. Yeah, if art is something special that comes from the artist, right? Well, what really comes from the artist? What are we really? But the point is, everything is shit, and we want to basically spread shit over the world. Now, that's a negative portrait, but partly my purpose tonight is to try to explain the unrelieved negativity, why it has been so prominent, and to say that there are deep reasons for it, and those deep reasons are philosophical. If you read the major intellectuals of the late 1800s and early 1900s, this is the world they portray. Artists absorb it, and artists do what they do, and they find unique ways to express it in their artworks. And there is a logic to the apparent illogic. There is a sense to the apparent nonsensical nature of the art world here.